Graham Platner is fending off multiple controversies just days before the primary. As some Democrats grow increasingly anxious about his liability, progressive Congressman Ro Khanna rallied with Platner on Friday, saying he deserves redemption.
As every single piece of that past and journey gets dug up, litigated, and weaponized, you have my back. And when politically motivated, serious and false accusations are made against me, Maine, you have my back.
We need to find some way of saying that if someone felt hurt by Graham in a past relationship, we can listen to them and we can listen to Graham and we can have conversations as mature Americans.
All right, for more, let's bring in House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, joining me exclusively this morning. Leader Jeffries, great to have you here, sir.
Good morning. Great to be with you.
Good morning. So Democrats, Leader Jeffries, including yourself, have argued for many years that women alleging instances of misconduct and abuse must be believed, or it enables abusers. You, for instance, wanted to pause Justice Kavanaugh's nomination over the allegation from Christine Blasey Ford that he attempted to sexually assault her in high school. But with Maine's Senate seat up for grabs, the standard does not seem to apply now. Listen to this.
So far, everything that has come out is a private matter between Graham Platner and his wife. Where I draw the line is if there are any credible allegations of abuse or assault or domestic violence.
But the New York Times interviewed 3 women who accused Platner of physical intimidation and abusive behavior, including ex-girlfriend Lindsay Fifield. Quote, she said he regularly grabbed her by the shoulders, sometimes hard enough to leave marks, and on one occasion yanked her out of a cab by her wrist after an argument when she wanted to stay in the car. During one argument, she recalled he twisted her arm behind her back, shoved her into a bedroom, and held the door closed from the other side so she couldn't get out, telling her to remain there until she was calm. Eventually, Ms. Fifield said she fell asleep and left the next morning. That sounds like domestic abuse to me, textbook domestic abuse. What happened to believe all women?
I haven't followed these allegations closely, but what I have said is that violence against women in any way, shape, or form is unacceptable. It's a red line, and nobody should cross that. And any accuser who comes forward has to be treated with dignity and respect. I haven't talked to Ro Khanna about this particular race, and in fact, I haven't gotten involved in this particular race because we're focused on taking back control of the House of Representatives so we can lower the high cost of living, fix our broken healthcare system, and clean up the corruption that is out of control in Washington, D.C. right now.
Okay. Well, Platner's baggage is about more than just these women, though. I want to ask you also about the direction of your party, because before this story came out, he was trying to downplay his Nazi tattoo, and he posted, Susan Collins' latest financial report just came out. A staggering 1/3 of her money raised this quarter came directly from AIPAC. Senator Collins is bought and paid for by Benjamin Netanyahu, and she votes accordingly. AIPAC is an American organization, as you know, and Collins voted for the War Powers Resolution, so saying she's bought and paid for by Netanyahu is a bit of a reach. But, you know, blaming the Jews seems like a risky defense for a guy with a Nazi tattoo who's trying to convince people that it was just an innocent mistake and it doesn't mean anything. Are you concerned that your party has an anti-Semitism problem?
He's going to have to speak for himself, and that's what any candidate, particularly in a high-profile race, is going to be called upon to do. Listen, the effort to crush anti-Semitism in America shouldn't be a partisan issue. It can't be a red or blue issue. It's a red, white, and blue issue. It's an American issue, and we should all be committed to crushing anti-Semitism and all other forms of hatred into the ground, bury it, and make sure it can never rise again.
Okay. On that point, you know, you just congratulated Adam Hamawy for becoming the Democratic nominee in New Jersey. Despite his past, you know, volunteering as a defense witness for Omar Abdel Rahman, the blind sheikh who was convicted in connection with the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. And according to trial transcripts obtained by Fox, Hamawy admitted under cross-examination that he did hear Rahman talk about jihad. He said, It was a struggle in the sake of God. Yes, it was a jihad. When the prosecutor asked if he heard Rahman talk about how America is the enemy of Islam, Hamawy answered yes. And when asked, did you hear about how Muslims had to do jihad against the enemies of Islam before the arrest in June 1993, Hamawy said, of course, that's what he always talked about. He talked about jihad, you know. Hamawy wants to represent the 12th district in New Jersey. That's where Todd Beamer is buried, the passenger who fought off the hijackers on United Flight 93. That doesn't concern you?
I haven't spoken to him. He's going to have to speak for himself and address these allegations, and I certainly haven't read the transcript that you just presented to me. But what I can say is that we, as Democrats and Republicans, particularly in an environment right now where this is day 100 of Donald Trump's reckless and costly war of choice, have to be focused on ensuring, one, that we always, at all times, protect the national security interests of the American people. That's not what's happening right now as it relates to what's going on in Iran. In fact, Iran is stronger now than they were before this reckless and costly war of choice was started, and life is more expensive, particularly as it relates to gas prices. And so, as it relates to national security interests, I think front and center right now is ensuring that the Senate moves on the Democratic resolution that just passed the House of Representatives to actually end this reckless and costly war of choice and put the American people first, which is what the president promised that he was going to do. Not start wars in the Middle East, but stop them. Unfortunately, the Trump administration has turned around and done the exact opposite.
Okay. I want to ask you, though, also about these candidates stepping on the message that you're talking about right now, because AOC was asked about his candidacy this week. She said she's not concerned, but there's a question that's out there about how much your party is willing to stomach when it embraces candidates like this. I mean, Hamawy also spent a month at a Gaza hospital where the Israelis later found a tunnel that was linked directly to one of the masterminds of the October 7th attack, Sinwar. But he told a magazine that he saw no weapons there and it was a completely benign civilian hospital with no tunnels. He also volunteered in Bosnia for a nonprofit that was later determined to be a front for al-Qaeda. Photos of bin Laden were found during the raid. You know, how much are Democrats willing to stomach at the, when they're trying to unseat Republicans in Congress, are they willing to let their values go?
It's very interesting that you've asked me about candidates, many of whom haven't even confronted a Democratic primary yet, but haven't asked me a single question about the hatred, the xenophobia, the Islamophobia, the outright racism that we see being peddled by actual members of Congress in the Republican conference sitting in the House of Representatives right now. And by the way, what we also know is that this Republican-controlled Congress has failed the people of this country. They promised to lower costs on day one. Costs haven't gone down. Costs have gone up. The cost of living in this country is out of control. There are far too many people of every race, of every region, all across this country who are working hard, they're playing by the rules, but they are unable to actually thrive. They can barely survive. People are struggling to live paycheck to paycheck. So as House Democrats, we're going to continue to focus on driving down the high cost of living and addressing the problems that the American people have asked us to confront.
Okay, I've got plenty of questions on that for our next guest, who is a Republican. I think it's appropriate to ask Republicans about Republicans and Democrats about Democrats. You're the minority leader, and these are members of your conference that are going out and campaigning with these unsavory figures. But on an issue that is coming to the floor this week, FISA is going dark. You were one of 147 Democrats who voted to reauthorize it in 2024, and then you voted to block it this year. The policy has not changed, and if you're going to argue now that there's a risk to American civil liberties, I'd just ask you to point to a single instance of abuse of this statute since the reforms were enacted. Just one.
Policies haven't changed, but the people in office certainly have. And in fact, the FISA court has expressed concern that there have been violations of policy as it relates to this current administration. The other thing that should be pointed out is that we're being asked to trust the privacy and the national security interests of the American people, not just to Donald Trump, but also to Kash Patel and now Bill Pulte, who has been put forward as the acting director of national intelligence. Republicans have criticized that nomination or Donald Trump elevating this particular individual because he has no national security background, he has no law enforcement background, and he has no military background. He is deeply unqualified. It's dangerous to put him in the office. And so, yes, there are real concerns as it relates to moving forward with FISA 702 at a moment in time, particularly when the president injected this hand grenade in the middle of sensitive negotiations.
And I'm going to ask our next guest about that. But is that an appropriate place to seek leverage, this critical national security tool over a single personnel decision? That could jeopardize the safety of every person in this country. And, would you do the same if it were, if the shoe were on the other foot? I mean, how is that an appropriate place
Bill Pulte,
to let FISA go dark?
Bill Pulte will jeopardize the safety and the security of the American people if he's allowed to proceed in this position as Director of National Intelligence. That's not a partisan position, by the way. Democrats and Republicans have a big problem with this, including Senate Majority Leader, Republican Senate Majority Leader John Thune. Now, as it relates to FISA 702, you've got Democrats and Republicans on both sides of this issue. We recognize the importance of the tool as a vehicle to protect the national security interests of the American people, while at the same time, we have to protect the privacy and the civil liberties of the American people. And you've got people on both sides of this issue.
Would you have your members vote?
We'll have to have that
reauthorize
conversation.
Okay.
Well, we'll have to have that conversation. Certainly, it's going to be hard for a substantial number of Democrats to actually vote for any authorization moving forward with Pulte still in effect as the Director of National Intelligence. But there's a whole host of other substantive issues that we were in the process of working out to strike the right balance on behalf of the American people that still have to be addressed in a bipartisan and an authentic fashion.
Okay. Well, we hope to continue to talk to you about it. Leader Jeffries, thank you very much for sharing your time with us this morning. Always appreciate the conversation, sir, and I hope to see you again.
Be sure to like and subscribe for all the Fox News latest on YouTube and catch full shows streaming now on Fox One.